Today Nagaraj is going to give second lecture on secularism. Dr. Nagaraj.
Today I am going to talk about secularism or the question of religious identity. Before that, I thought I will explain some of the central considerations that I have shaped my method. In this particular series of talks, I am interested in exploring the connection between public imagination and literary imagination. I've got a proposition to test here, that is, somewhere the public imagination of a society, the public imagination of a culture does not really eventually condition the literary imagination of that particular society. In other words, there is a fundamental tension between a society's public and literary imagination. Usually, the public imagination of a society is conditioned, is shaped by a whole range of factors. Mainly, it's conditioned by a play of power, temporal power, political power, and other factors also play a crucial role in presenting or in reinforcing the public imagination of a society. To borrow a metaphor from literature, public imagination is the sky of a society. It appears as though it's all-inclusive. It appears as though it has shaped and conditioned every other activity that occurs in the space of that particular society. So it appears as though the public imagination of a society is complete, is total. We've been led to believe the ultimate power of public imagination for the last 100 or 150 years in our political and literary theory. It's also true to a certain extent. But my belief in literature stems from the fact, stems from the conviction, as I explained it yesterday, that literature ultimately seeks to interrogate some of the pretensions of public imagination. Literature is literature precisely because it has the temerity, it has some kind uninformed confidence to interrogate some of the assumptions, pretensions of the public imagination. So my fundamental belief is that literature is precious to us, that literature is absolutely sacred to us because it seeks to interrogate mercilessly, severely, some of the positions that have shaped the public imagination. Last evening in my talk I explored the role played by nationalism, the role played by nation state as an ideology. But I also made it clear yesterday that in one particular sector, literature endorses some of the pretensions of nationalism, some of the pretensions of the public imagination, but in its interstices, it refuses to accept the dictates of the public imagination. So literary imagination achieves its autonomy, achieves its state of a little nest when it seeks to subvert public imagination, sometimes from within. So literature is important because of the spaces it creates for hiding. Literature is important because it tries to create certain ravines, certain crevices where minor things, minor beings can take refuge. So literature is a space of refuge. Literature is a space of self-protection of a society. So this is the kind of theoretical understanding about literature. So today I thought I will talk about one of the crucial themes that has exercised the public imagination. I thought I will describe it as a problem of secularism, but I thought it's better to explain it or explore it as a theme related to the problem of religious identity. And hence the title of my talk today is Secularism or the Problem of Religious Identity with a question mark. I'm not going to present a coherent narrative today on the problem of religious identity. Let me begin with a very bold statement, with a very, very bold proposition that is almost commonsensical, that it is the problem of religious identity, along with the theme of nationalism, that has exercised the mind of the public imagination. It's one of the vexed problems that the public imagination of the country is bothered with this always. To begin with, let me offer you a kind of historical account of contestations that are there in the problem of religious identity. There is fierce contestation between two positions. And the entire discourse on the problem of religious identity has been shaped, has been conditioned by a very fierce plural confrontations between two positions. For the purposes of academic clarity, I have named them the contest between the constructivist and the essentialist position. In other words, if you describe this as a problem of religious identity, the problem of religious identity has dominated the public imagination, say, over the past 100 years or so. It's one of the single most important sources of inspiration to our literature. As I explained it yesterday, at one point of time, nationalism itself was accepted as a form of religion. Nationalism itself was presented as a form of authentic religious experience. But fortunately, that did not last. Fortunately, that did not survive. So, for the last 100 years or so, now, the conflict is between two positions on this question. One, I call it the constructivist position, the second one, the essentialist position. The constructivist position on the question of religious identity has somewhat it treats the problem of religious identity with a great deal of suspicion and contempt. In fact, today, in contemporary culture and political theories, it is the school of constructivism that rules the roast. It is the most influential schools in today's academic world. So what exactly are the main positions of this constructivist school? What are its arguments? At one level, the arguments of the constructivist schools are very simple and straightforward. As I told you, it treats the problem of religious identity with a great deal of suspicion and contempt. It just doesn't accept the problem of religious identity as an authentic one. It has two explanations for that. One, it believes that all such identity talks or all such identity narratives are again, as I told you yesterday, constructs of imagination. It's also over-determined by a whole range of factors, politics included among them, of course. So it holds that the identity narrative of any community, for that matter, is essentially a matter of imagination. It's an imaginative concept. If it's a Hindu identity, many of the champion scholars of the school of constructivism argue that it has been essentially a product of colonialism. The whole Hindu-Muslim divide was created in the colonial phase of history, so it does not really go beyond the period of colonial history. This is the first position of the constructivist position. This is the first position of the constructivist school. The second position is also very curious. They argue that all such identities are invented. Some of the leading theoretical texts in this area have titles like Inventing a Tradition, Imagining a Community, Imagine Communities, Inventing a Tradition. So from the far right to the far left, there exists a kind of consensus on this question. Even some liberals and conservatives, they more or less have a consensus on this particular question. They say all these religious identities are invented. In fact, religion is presented as one of the candidates for nationalism, the other two being language and a certain kind of geocultural territory. So there are three candidates for nationalism. First, religious identity. The second one, linguistic identity. The third one is ethnic or a certain kind of geopolitical identity. As I told you, the constructivists are have by and large emerged as the single most influential school in the politics of knowledge systems today. But the irony is that they are not really influential in everyday politics. They are not really decisive enough to control the events in politics, say in everyday life or in the public sphere, to use a cliche. Whereas it is the school of essentialists, they hold the key, in fact. So if the school of constructivists, if they are the most influential school in the world of knowledge systems, in real politics, it is the school of essentialists who rule the roast. Politically, they are the most influential ones. So there exists a kind of primordial, it appears as though the conflict is a primordial one. There exists a conflict between the constructivists and the essentialists. So now let's pause for a while and look at the positions of the essentialists. They hold that there is nothing historical about certain religious identities. They operate beyond history. Say, for instance, take the positions of Hindu fundamentalists or Hindu narratives. Take the positions of Islamic narratives. Similarly, take the positions of Jewish or Christian narratives. Their basic belief tells them that religious identities are born beyond history, that they have come to play and they should play a significant role in shaping contemporary history. So they don't accept history, or to be more precise, they want religious identities to play a significant role in the contemporary society of a nation. So they try to replace certain categories with religious identity. So their second position is that if you take the problem of, say, Hindu narratives, Hindu identity narratives, or Islamic identity narratives, they argue that it has remained unchanged for several centuries. It has remained unchanged for several millennia. So this is the position today, that there exists a fundamental conflict between the constructivists and the essentialists. There is a problem of space here. In other words, the discourse on the question of religious identity is totally dominated by these two schools. There is no space for the third one. The essentialists argue that it is not invented. The religious identity is not invented. It's not an imaginative construct. It has been there all along. Whereas the constructivists argue there is nothing sacred about it, or there is nothing original about it. It has been invented. It's a product of history. In today's debate on religious identity, we can notice that there is no space left for the third position on the question of religious identity. The essentialists seek to impose their views on Indian society with violence, and they have almost succeeded in reinforcing their narrative. But the constructivists, usually constructivists consist of Marxists, modernists, liberals. They argue that there is nothing permanent about these categories, that there is nothing stable about these categories. So the discourse is completely dominated by the irreconcilable positions between the two. If you study the documents published by texts and documents published by both constructivists and the essentialists, history is got to them. You cannot deny the importance of history. So both of them are great worshippers of a certain kind of history. They believe in historical knowledge, and they believe in history as a vehicle of great truth. So both of them are historicists. So a new kind of historicism has taken over the political imagination of these two schools. In reality, I would like to put forward a scandalous proposition that there is no basic difference between the essentialists and constructivists. It doesn't mean that there are no other kinds of philosophical spaces. There are philosophical spaces which refuse to accept history as a sole vehicle of truth. But a new kind of historicism has enveloped, has totally hijacked the discourse on the problem of religious identity. In India today, if you want to be visible in the public sphere, you have to belong, you have to choose your mode of intellectual self-representation. You have to be a constructivist, or you have to be an essentialist. There is no third space available. But fortunately in Indian history, there has always been a great deal of scope for a very innovative space for the third position. I call that a historical approach to the problem of history. As I told you yesterday, Gandhi was one such, Gandhi represented one such position. He did not really believe in history, he believed in sociology. I don't want to go into the details of this, but if you accept, say, the Gandhian position on the problem of religious identity, or the matter, say, Ambedkar's position on religious identity, you have defined for yourself a secular space. But today, in today's India, what I call a historical approach to history, or a historical approach to the problem of religious identity, is not all that influential. For that matter, it's not even legitimate. So this is the first part of the story. The second part, I will go back to literature. So here also I'm interested in presenting a story. If one accepts the idea that histories of literature itself themselves can be presented as a story, I would like to do that here. What about our writers? What about our poets, our best poets? Did they internalize the values of the constructivists and essentialists? Fortunately, they didn't do that. But what really happened was, take, for example, poems of Bendre, poems of Kumaranashan, Tagore. These are some of our great poets. I would call this the fragmentation of the creative sensibility in India. I would describe this as a process of fragmentation of creative sensibility. There are two dimensions to religious vision, to religious discourse. So one is image, the second one is ritual, the third one is worldview, and the fourth one is ethics. Our poets did succeed in one thing, that they opted for vision and ethics, left out the thick description of everyday forms of religious life. For instance, you take poetry of Kumaranashan and compare that with Narayana Guru. Narayana Guru also was a great poet. He has written several important poems in Malayalam. I would like to draw your attention to one particular poem of his called, in English it's called Song of the Snake. It's a poem about Kundalini. It's called Kundalini Part 2. It's a poem about, at one level, snake. But it's essentially a poem about the spiritual evolution of a human being. The irony is compounded further by the fact that Kumaranashan could not have written a poem like this. So I don't want to go into the details of this fragmentation of sensibility. The gulf that existed between Kumaranashan and Narayana Guru was complete, it was unbridgeable, because Kumaranashan in a way wanted to remain secular. He wanted to develop, like other poets from other Indian languages like Bendre, Kuvempu, Tagore, they wanted to create a new poetry of secular spirituality. So if one wants to write a poetry of secular spirituality, you are forced to leave out what I call areas of thick description from your creativity. You have to leave out certain areas to be able to write a new kind of poetry, which we can call poetry of secular spirituality. So the second proposition is, the problem of religious identity in literary imagination has been tackled by effecting a split between, metaphorically speaking, Kumaranashan and Narayana Guru. Narayana Guru wanted to create, like many other Indian poets, a poetry of secular spirituality. Whereas in reality, Kumaranashan, contrasted to Kumaranashan, Narayana Guru was deeply rooted in his traditional worldview. He was deeply rooted in his traditional images. When he wrote poems like Kundalini Part 2, there are many poems written by him. They were, in a way, not taken seriously as literature, because in modern Indian literary imagination, by and large, only secular spirituality was accepted as authentic. The rest were treated as religious in the negative sense of the word. For instance, we are yet to see, at least in Kannada, Devistutis. Though Bendre has written many such poems, but if you study any writing, critical writing on Bendre, there is hardly any discussion on such traditional religious poetry, verse written by Bendre. So I would argue that though the mode of secular spirituality helped Indian poets to solve the problem of religious identity, but it was limited, terrifyingly limited, because of its obsession to create poetry in the mode of secular spirituality. Once you accept the notion of secular spirituality, you are forced to leave other areas of thick description, other areas which are not easily accessible to you, other areas which are not easily accessible to the public imagination in a modern world. So this is the gist of my presentation today. If you have any questions, I would like to have a longish discussion on some of the questions that I raised yesterday. Maybe we can treat it as an ongoing narrative. So I would like to continue the discussion in the form of question and answer sessions, and my colleagues Manu and Dr. Asha Devi will also help me in taking the discussion forward. Thank you.
I'll just give you the example of as I was discussing with a few friends this afternoon, the example of what happened and the response of one of our important thinkers today. Now, much before the Islamic revolution in Iran, Iran under the Shah of Iran under the Shah, created a certain notion of a society, of a modern society, which for many represented nothing but propagating United States, the imperialist policies of the United States. Now it was at this juncture that Khomeini, who was then in France, in Paris in exile, the upsurge of religious identity, now mainly spearheaded by somebody like the Ayatollah, was an attempt to create a kind of a religious identity, an Islamic religious identity, which would counter the imperialist policies of the United States, as they were being furthered by the Shah of Iran. Now, if this is one part of the story, look at what the position of a person like Edward Said is. Declares that he is a secularist, declares that he does not believe in any religion, any religious experience. Now for Said, the moment the upsurge of religious nationalism, the moment he notices the upsurge of the religious nationalist fervor in Iran, it becomes a very important space for him to intervene to fight US imperialist practices. Now the basic secularist position is, if people are struggling, whatever be the nature of Khomeini or whatever Khomeini turned out to be later on is a different matter. For Said, the most important aspect is to fight for the religious identity, the Islamic religious identity, which would by implication fight US imperialist practices. Now when questioned about this later on, Said says, my own secularist position is, without trying to define what secularism is, he says, if this religious identity should turn out to be very oppressive, tyrannical, now when Khomeini launches a theocratic state, he says it's again part of the duty of a secularist to fight this religious fundamentalism. So on one hand, to fight for the religious identity of a people. On the other hand, to fight that religious identity if it turns out to be very tyrannical. Now, when we try to correlate several things, I don't know, I think we should also arrive at our own understanding of what religious identity is, what national identity is, of what secularism is. So I'm very wary of offering a definition of secularism, because when you try to define something, you get implicated in many other positions. Now this is the only response I can give by way of trying to clear some basic confusion.
Friends, I thought I can wrap up the debate by trying to answer, not in any comprehensive way, but trying to do it in a very tentative way. What is it that I'm trying to argue today? Let me translate back my arguments in common sense positions, into common sense positions. First, the question of religious identity has been responsible for violence and bloodshed in this country for the last 50 or 60 years. So I'm trying to translate back some of my abstract positions into the language of newspapers. So that's one of the single most important sources of violence. We have been agitated over this question of religious identity. Are we Hindus? Are we Muslims? We have also been equally agitated, or probably more agitated, over the question of secularism, the definition of secularism. In the context of contemporary India, the question of religious identity is organically coupled with the problem of the definition of secularism. What exactly we mean by secularism? This is the question. Let me try to describe what exactly we mean by secularism. I'm not trying to offer any foundational definition of the notion of secularism. I'm just trying to describe the practices that are going on in India today in the name of secularism. First, it has been understood as a cultural practice of the Indian state. So secularism has been a professed ideology of the Indian state. So it is, as I told you, it is seen as a cultural practice of the modern Indian state. It's also seen as an attempt to, it's also seen as an attempt of decultured people to present a certain notion of Western secularism, to enforce a certain Western notion of secularism on Indian society. So this is the second character. So it is the slogan and ideology of the decultured people. It is alleged this way. So when secularism has come to mean cultural practices of a state, in any society for that matter, there is bound to emerge opposition. There is a certain kind of political, cultural hostility has emerged to these practices of the state. But again, in fact, when I talked about the essential tension between constructivists and essentialists, to translate that back into common sense language today, it only means that we have two options, that we have two modes of analyzing the problem of religious identity in today's India. One, the essentialist talk of the Hindu fundamentalists. They say that we have been like this for the last 2000 years. And the liberal, the secular, modernist response to the language and politics of Hindu fundamentalists. That is the constructivist argument. Interestingly, it's only the modernists, Marxists, who came up with some kind of a coherent response two essentialists. So only two people are quarreling in the scene, the modernists and the Hindu fundamentalists. So ironically, both of them have many things in common. Both of them have many worldviews in common. Both of them believe in history. Both of them believe in the primacy of a certain understanding of history. So the common man's question is, query is there any third alternative? This I would call the ahistorical approach to the problem of history, or the ahistorical approach to the problem of religious identity. I believe that there is a third alternative, that is the left Gandhian alternative. So you just imagine a scenario where the Hindu fundamentalists can quarrel, can dismiss the constructivists easily. In fact, the great document of constructivists that has come in recent years is a book, it's called The Anatomy of a Confrontation. So you compare some of the most brilliant essays of that book with the publications of the Sangha Parivar. So the question of historical evidence is important. So the question of facticity is important. So historical evidence and historical fact is considered to be whole truths, uncontaminated truths. Both of them quarrel over notions of verifiable history. In other words, the strategy of the essentialists is to historicize a religious experience. The strategy of the essentialists is to treat a symbol as the difference that exists between the symbol and the real disappears here. They treat the symbol as a historically verifiable real fact. The symbol becomes real and historical in this sense. That explains the radical energy released by the politics of Hindu fundamentals. So then what exactly is the problem here? The problem is, in certain religious discourses, history is not taken as the absolute. History is one of the appearances of reality. History is not everything. And symbols at one level are not real. So there is no point in exaggerating the importance of symbols both in religious life and in historical life also. The symbols are not all that important. So then what did so the constructivists, in a way, they are interested in opposing the school of essentialists, but they resort more or less to the same method practiced by essentialists. They are, once again, to make an excessive statement, politically they are different, but methodologically they are identical. There exists a great deal of methodological affinity, a philosophical affinity between the two. They endorse more or less an identical approach to history. Let's take Gandhi, for example. Let's take Gandhi as an example and his politics. He was a Hindu. So even the essentialists cannot dismiss the Gandhian credentials, of the Hindu credentials of Gandhi. Gandhi remained a Hindu till his death. But for essentialists, it's quite easy to dismiss even certain cultural pretensions of constructivists. For example, only very recently, the left in India have taken culture seriously. So, secularism was analyzed as a cultural practice of the state, and ideologically, it was seen as a strategy or a cultural policy of certain political classes in India. So secularism has always been treated at one level as a cultural policy of the state and cultural policy of certain political classes. So other political classes who were opposed to, it's also a matter of, say, party politics. One uses a common sense word. It's also a matter of party politics. They wanted to oppose both the cultural practices of the state and of certain political classes. So they came up with what we call the problem of religious identity and converted that into a political question. But Gandhi was the only one who rejected the politics of religious identity. Take, for example, two major symbols that he has created in his political life. One is salt, and the other one is spinning wheel. And he created these symbols not from the womb of common memories, common cultural memories, because essentialists can survive only on the basis of creating cultural memories. So their symbols are a product of cultural memories, their symbols are a product of religious memories for that matter. And the constructivists argue that even memories can be created, even memories can be rigged. So, in other words, even memories can be created. That is the political position of the constructivists. So you can invent memories, and the essentialists have done such things in the past. So Gandhi created symbols, two symbols, which were very effective in the life of, in the national struggle of India. One is salt, a quotidian object, an object of everyday usage, an object of everyday life, was elevated to the status of a symbol. And then the second one, the spinning wheel. Both of them were available to all classes. So they were secular in the fundamental sense of the word. It was not the cultural practice of the state, it was the expression of a different kind of culturalist understanding of India. So now the question is, how is it that when essentialists unleashed a reign of terror, when violence, when a certain kind of religious violence became the order of the day, how is it that the third paradigm that I talked about, the paradigm of a historical approach to history, lost its energy? It was no longer relevant. It was no longer legitimate. It just did not have the energy to counter the arguments of the essentialists. So today's India is bleak because the arena is taken over by constructivists and essentialists. They are politically different. There is no point in erasing the political difference between the two. There is no point in arguing that there is no difference, say, between Sarvepalli Gopal or Rumila Thapar or Safdar Rashmi and champions of the Sangh Parivar, ideologues of the Sangh Parivar. Politically they are different. But somewhere their approach to history, their approach to cultural symbols, their understanding of the role of symbols in everyday life, I think they have many things in common. So today my plea was to create a space for the third alternative. There is no point in rejecting the importance of cultural memories in our society, because with all said and done, cultural policies of certain political classes in India did not have any respect for the religious worldviews or the cultural worldviews of the common people of India. They were alienated, they were really decultured. So when the backlash appeared in Indian history, the constructivists did not have a real political answer, but it goes to their credit that they fought a bitter battle against the essentialists. So we should congratulate them. They have worked hard to preserve the sanity of Indian society, but I think it's high time to look for a new space, to look for the third alternative represented by Gandhi. So in a sense, to put it in a nutshell, this was my argument today. So maybe we'll come back tomorrow and I will try to conclude this. I will try to bring some kind of a coherence into my three-part narrative. So thank you all for having listened to me so patiently. Thank you. Essential for the making of a nation state. In those empty spaces, certain communities are made to disappear. Say tribals are made to disappear. Certain lower castes are made to disappear. Certain pre-modern technological communities are disappear. So nationalism is not only an act of emergence, it's also a complex act of disappearance. Certain communities will have to lose their identity. Certain communities will have to lose their means of livelihood also. So nationalism is possible only when certain forms of life disappear. So this is what happens when you endorse the idea of a strong nation state. As I told you yesterday, the very idea of a nation state, the very idea of modern nationalism inevitably attracts violence. So violence is inbuilt into the very making of nationalism. Violence is inbuilt into the very making of a nation state. So as opposed to this, there are other forms of presenting societal organizations of a geocultural territory. I am consciously using this phrase, geocultural territory. So basically they have a vision of a culturally unified society. The moment you talk about what Rajani Kothari calls mega development narrative, if you believe in the idea of mega development, then it becomes inevitable that certain communities will have to sacrifice their lifestyle, will have to sacrifice their forms of life. So at one level, my point is, a certain kind of epistemic disappearance of communities makes nationalism possible. So theoretically speaking, nationalism is possible only when certain communities disappear epistemically. It is the epistemic disappearance of a community that makes nationalism possible. And it also explains the extra energy, the extra social energy released by the self-congratulatory practices of the middle classes. A new kind of radical energy is released. But fortunately, or according to nationalists, unfortunately, the newly released radical energy can never percolate down, or it can never reach certain corners of the society. They are untouched by the new current that gets released. They are not touched by the new social energy that gets released. So if you present nationalism as a new mechanism which seeks to release social energy, which seeks to release radical energies, only certain sectors experience that release of radical energy, and certain sectors, certain communities die an epistemic death. First, they are dead as communities. So nationalism, to repeat my argument in commonsensical way, when a new world is born, the old world or the old worlds will have to disappear to make way for the emergence of the new one. So nationalism is simultaneously a cause for celebration and also an occasion for mourning. So celebration and mourning are organically intertwined. So a big dam is a symbol of a nation. Jawaharlal Nehru described them as mega dams as temples of modern India. So when you build a temple, certain other forms of religious worship, certain other forms of life practiced by several communities disappear in the darkness of naturalism. So naturalism is not only a metaphor for light, it's also a metaphor for darkness. I would say it's very difficult. So there is no point in there is no point in celebrating nationalism blindly, precisely because of that. It's also an occasion for mourning.